This is Research Spotlight at Cumbria.
We need ideas like we need food.
What is already working that makes Cumbria a flourishing place to live? You know, what's already happening on the ground?
In this podcast series, we're profiling our researchers, hearing in detail about their work and the impact this has on wider society.
I'm interested because I'm very interested in Charlotte Mason.
The learning aspect is so vital, and people feeling empowered and engaged and mobilized is important.
In this episode, Dr. David Murphy, Associate Professor of Sustainability and Collaborative Leadership, and postgraduate researcher Joanna Stanberry discuss their work.
So I actually moved across an ocean with my family to study here at the University of Cumbria because it's also the home of her ideas, Charlotte Mason. And having Scale Howe, having her former teachers' college at the Ambleside campus, means that the University of Cumbria is the holder of her legacy, really, for the world. So I came here to explore what the relevance of her ideas might be for people today, especially for people who are interested in thinking about what I call sustainability leadership. But it's really about the ways different people work together across those differences in order to create a more flourishing community or world.
It's interesting because we hear a lot about Charlotte Mason in this country. We're often told that she's kind of a trendsetter, a leading kind of light. And to hear somebody from the US to say that as well, it validates that. Just give us a headline of why she is so remarkable.
I think the most important idea she has, in some ways, which is applying a lot in our research, well, I'd say two ideas. One is she trusts people to be able to learn. And once you trust somebody, she called it the born personhood of all people. Once you trust them to be persons who have capacities for caring and knowledge, then it transforms the way that you can approach developmental spaces. And the second idea she had was that knowledge matters, that ideas, concrete ideas, abstract ideas, living ideas, ideas that come from passionate people and from nature and from wonderful literature and from poetry, that those ideas really matter. She called Ambleside a university without walls. And so that idea, in terms of how we think about developing sustainability leadership, is incredibly important because it turns out you need to know about the peat and the dirt and who's poor and why in order to make any of those changes.
So the small stuff as much as the great kind of world in which we live as well. And David, I wonder, is that similar for yourself? And the reason when you kind of get involved in the area of work that you've done, we've spoken before in this podcast series, if you go way, way back, is that why you chose to look at this rather than something else?
Well, I've been at the University of Cumbria now for just over 10 years. I think the reason why I came here, because this is later in my professional life, I came here after having worked in West Africa, around the world really, with international development work with UN agencies, NGOs and businesses. And I came here because I was interested in the local application of the kinds of things that I was working on elsewhere in the world. There was an opportunity to come to work full-time in a university, and I hadn't done that up to that point in my career. I really have enjoyed the teaching. I would say probably initially that was the thing that really excited me, was the opportunity to engage with mature students largely on MBA programs who came to Ambleside from around the world. So the world came to Ambleside for that program, and that was a real connection between my past experience and the new experience of working in the university. But if I move from the teaching to the research has really taken off in the last 4 or 5 years. And you might say, well, why did it take me that long to get focused on research? Probably because of the heavier teaching load I had initially, and also that I was quite excited by and passionate about the teaching that I was doing. But opportunities emerged, and it was really during COVID when things started in a big way. We had some funding come through from an organization called UKRI, which is a UK government funder that provides the university with funding for research and knowledge exchange work. And we were starting to develop relationships locally with various networks, the Ethical Small Traders Association, ESTA, the Lancaster City Council, and then later Cumbria Development Education Centre, CDEC, out of Ambleside, and a whole range of what I would say civil society, business, and local or public organizations. And there was a sense locally, I think, particularly in the Lancaster district, of an interest in sense-making about sustainable development, sort of trying to look at what that meant locally here, and partnership working and engaging stakeholders was seen as one of the ways in which we would most effectively try to undergo that process of sense-making with local actors.
And it's interesting as well, as listeners may well detect, so we've got a Canadian and American collaborating as well. So did you just, when you both met up, and did you obviously think, look, we've got things in common here, we need to collaborate and work together? How did your research, just start to talk about research now, how did you get together? Sounds like a dating show now, doesn't it? But how did you meet each other? How did you get together?
Well, I'd already had, one of the things that left out of that initial bit was that I had various PhD students that I was working with as well. So, it wasn't just in the classroom. I was working alongside various PhD researchers. And an opportunity came through in 2021, I think it was initially, maybe early 2022. And a colleague of ours, visiting Professor Richard Little, who was involved in the development of the Initiative for Leadership and Sustainability, IFLAS, out of Ambleside, and someone who's had a connection to the Ambleside campus going back decades, when it was St. Martin's College, and I think even when it was Charlotte Mason College. But he introduced Joanna to me. He knew Joanna and her family, and had connections with them and his academic work. But he's also, like me, I would call a pracademic. He's worked a lot in business, and but also worked with us at the university. And he introduced me to Joanna. We started corresponding, and that led to her applying and eventually then coming.
I've been doing leadership research for over 20 years on the side. So I had all sorts of day jobs in every industry you can imagine.
So Chaz, go and give us ideas.
Oh, wow. I was a buyer for an e-commerce website. I was a paralegal at a hedge fund, head of communications for a large homeless services agency, and in the midst of that had also thought about becoming a home educator. We had a phrase, leaders in the making, about all of our undergraduate students, but a key focus on developing research around leadership, even at the undergraduate level. And so I was sent on 2 research trips, one to Bolivia and one to Brazil, that were both connected with sustainable development and leadership. So I came at leadership from a more critical, global South perspective, and had been doing this research on the side for about 20 years, like I said. And one day I received a piece of letterhead from Richard Little, and it said, "The Initiative for Leadership and Sustainability, Charlotte Mason Building." And my worlds collided. So my side thing of pursuing home education for my kids, and learning about Charlotte Mason's methods, and then later using them with lots of other home educators. So I helped run a conference in New York City. I was leading reading groups, reading through her original volumes from the 1900s. She published 6 books between, I believe it's 1882 and 1923 when she died. In the midst of that, I came at the research. I think this is really important. Maybe also from the teaching side, I had been tasked with teaching adult students who are police officers and firefighters about international leadership, and they didn't really want to learn about international leadership. So what I ended up doing was using a partnership guide for implementing the Sustainable Development Goals as their quote-unquote textbook, and I said, go create partnerships like it's a local organization and something global around creating change. And that was really transformative for me. So when David and I got together and started thinking about research, we both were coming from the perspective of the discursive power that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have to change the way people think about sustainability. So it's no longer just ecology or climate change or circular economy or any of these more narrow ways in which it gets defined. It's much bigger and broader. It's the connection of all these systems working together. And most importantly, perhaps, it's for vulnerable people and places all over the world, especially in Cumbria.
So both you had experience of working for NGOs, and you said in Bolivia as well. Amazing. So you've got all this, kind of experience from outside academia, which then you're bringing into this world using practical kind of real world examples. But I guess again the question is, how do you pass that on without, people think, first of all, perhaps not grasping what you're trying to achieve, but also perhaps being overawed by what you've done?
I think that it involves, and I think David would agree, it involves first recognize that everybody comes with deep knowledge on their own, wherever they come from, regardless of whether that's academic or not, and valuing and acknowledging those perspectives and that knowledge in any sort of collaboration, whether it's a research collaboration or a consultancy or even just a friendship. That valuing the knowledge that people bring is kind of the first piece. That's the born personhood I was talking about when we come together.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've noticed is the importance of really understanding the local context where we're working. Joanna's been here shorter than me, but I think naturally a curious, also gregarious in terms of her outreach and engagement with people. And I think I'm probably a little more on the reticent side in that regard. I'm not nearly as outgoing. But one of the things we both did is we have engaged with things like community conversations here in Lancaster, attended events, talked about our work, but more importantly, listened and trying to understand that local context and the experience. Joanna talks about the born personhood, but also that lived experience of the issues and challenges that people are facing. And those became more pronounced, I think, during the COVID time. And then post-COVID, many of those things that were surfaced in those online discussions, like community conversations, have kind of even accelerated in terms of things haven't died down post-COVID. They've intensified, I think, in terms of a sense amongst people of a need for their voices to be heard, and not taking those SDGs and saying, here you go, these are the things you need to be paying attention to.
Sorry, SDG? Just so people don't know.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Thanks.
Rather than taking that SDG, Sustainable Development Framework, that international framework, and trying to make the case as to why it's relevant locally, better to understand what people are experiencing, the challenges they're facing, and bringing that experience to bear the application of the SDGs here in Lancaster, but also more widely in Cumbria. And there's another project that we're working on called Strengthening Cumbria Civil Society that I would say almost deliberately, maybe not deliberately, but maybe by chance, has not used the language of the Sustainable Development Goals in the way we did in Lancaster. And it's revealing some interesting things as well, and we'll come on to that in a minute.
Excellent stuff.
Yeah. I did just want to jump in, though, and say that your question specifically was also about the relationship to research. And I think there's something about the way we engage, which a lot of researchers later think about impact, or impact is just a side to their core research questions. And our core research questions are about impact. So when we marry those things, it becomes a very different sort of dynamic. And some people call it action research. Sometimes that can be a narrow framing. I would say that we like to take a broad engagement around co-production of knowledge. And to do that, I think we also come as people willing to, knowing we do have expertise, we do have something to bring and to share. So I was going to give the example of working with the Lancaster City Council a year or two ago, where we were invited in to talk to the VCFSE sectors, the voluntary community social enterprise sector, and just do some capacity building around how we would measure the capabilities or the competencies, how we would think about them for working together, what are the barriers in the nonprofit, pardon my Americanness with nonprofit, the charitable sector, in terms of partnering and working outside of their silos. There's a really tough funding environment here. And so I think we've come to a lot of our settings knowing that we do have something to bring, something we can help with, in addition to trying to develop research and learn.
And would you say, I mean, just conscious that when we were coming here to record this podcast, we've passed 2 paramedics. This place is known, University of Cumbria is known for training ever increasing numbers of paramedics, crucial job, leadership and communication, everything is in there. Are they the kind of people that you think this research has has helped, from paramedics to the chief executive of the local council.
Well, you're taking me back to an interesting meeting I had. Part of what David was saying about this broad engagement, in this process, I became a director of ESTA, the Ethical Small Traders Association. And in that capacity, I've been part of the NHS Resilience Hub sort of gathering that's looking at how not just the Anchor Collaborative would care about Social Value Act, et cetera, but how small and medium-sized businesses, micro businesses, yoga instructors would begin to care about those things. So we were in a meeting having this conversation around resilience and for the community. And it was great because a local GP from Cumbria said, what usually happens is a bunch of NHS doctors get together and scratch our heads and say, why haven't we solved this problem yet? But he was really appreciative of the way in which people coming from management organization studies outside of medicine were trying to bring and contribute something that they thought was incredibly useful. So I absolutely think that the catchment, when you think about who this matters for, is much broader than how we typically think about research impact. Charlotte Mason said, education is an atmosphere, a discipline, and a life. And there's something about research, which essentially is learning, that is about a life. It's a life of learning. It's a life of building, growing, developing relationships with ideas. And so anything that we do, we're bringing in everything that came before that. And we're iterating on those ideas as we go. So I think that there's no way of saying this is the biggest thing, that's the biggest thing. I especially think that the way we define impact, research impact, desperately needs reframing. It leaves out a lot of marginalized people in terms of the way that the system itself has to measure that. So I think we have to rethink what we say is our best research, our biggest impact, and say maybe it's the one conversation we had last week with somebody and the ways in which those ideas influence them and the way their life is going to be, the trajectory is going to be slightly shifted as a result of that. Maybe that's actually, in the end, our biggest impact.
If you reach one person who otherwise wouldn't, isn't on social media or wouldn't have come to an event, that one person is worth more than the 10 people who are on social media and had some knowledge of something. Is that what you mean?
Well, let me give the good example is the study itself. So maybe I'll hand over to David to maybe explain what set us up for it, and then we'll come back around, and everybody who's listening can think about how right now we're talking about what is it that creates that moment of lifelong shift, and how that's critical in our research, but we'll come to it after David sets the stage.
The Strengthening Cumbria's Civil Society project started about a year ago, at least the kernel of the idea. Julie Mennel, the Vice Chancellor of the University, is also a Deputy Lieutenant for the Office of the Lord Lieutenant of Cumbria. Sorry about the Lieutenant. It's a bit of a joke with Joanna and I. I somehow have been living in the UK for 31 years, or at least in Europe, but primarily in the UK, and somehow didn't even notice the difference between those two pronunciations of that word. But anyway, Julie had met Alex Scott, who had been designated as the new Lord Lieutenant of Cumbria starting last July. And before he started, she put me in touch with him. And right from the beginning, he had an idea that he wanted his 10-year tenure as Lord Lieutenant to be somewhat different, I think, from many of his predecessors and others around the country who have the same role. He wanted to be proactive. He wanted to be listening and learning from what was most needed in Cumbria to improve the livelihoods of people, community life. And he saw civil society as a way of perhaps framing the work that he hoped to do. And he wanted to better understand what civil society actually meant in Cumbria. And so with those early conversations, subsequently Joanna became involved in those conversations with Alex, and we involved the Cumbria Development Education Centre, CDEC out of Ambleside, and some other colleagues. We began to scope out the idea of a project that would strengthen Cumbria's civil society. And we asked a couple of questions right from the beginning. And one was, what is most needed to create a more thriving and equitable community life in Cumbria? It's quite a nice, open, inviting, encouraging sort of language to use that we thought would be understood widely by the people that we hoped to engage and reach in the work. And I think it has worked to a great extent. We also were interested in what is already working that makes Cumbria a flourishing place to live. What's already happening on the ground. And so we have successfully had a series of workshops and around the county of Cumbria, starting in Ambleside, moving to Carlisle, then to Workington, and just on election day, July 4th, in Barrow, in Furness. And I think we probably had about 75 people across those 4 workshops, maybe a little bit less, a little bit more. And we've also been engaging people online. I think I'll hand over to Joanna next, just to say a little bit more about, why we're doing it, and a little bit more about the approach, the methodology, and what we're trying to find out.
Sure. So the technical term for what we're doing is called Q methodology. And it was started by William Stevenson in around 1935. And he PhD in quantum physics and in psychology. And he thought, what if we could look at what he called the operant subjectivity? So when subjectivity becomes operant, we can look at it in just a moment and get an idea of what that might mean. So what we have people do is we have around 50 statements. And when you develop those 50 statements, you develop them based on how local people, in this, the context of who your participants are, might respond to that question. So when you think about the question David just offered, what is needed for a more flourishing and equitable community life in Cumbria, it's answered in all sorts of ways. So it's answered in the how. How do we get there? Government needs to pay for more. People need to do more. People need to volunteer more. Wealthy people need to give more. There's a huge range of how. And then there's questions about the what. We need more schools. We need services for families. We need services for the disabled. We need to better understand culture and how multicultural spaces emerge. We need the environment to be put above everything else. We need to address the climate change emergency. So there's lots of ways people respond to that. And I was saying that Cumbria Crack was one of many places where I went to develop those statements, and they're all said in that local vernacular. So how would somebody respond in those words?
So they're authentic, aren't they?
They're all authentic language of how people would talk.
Websites,
reports,
Facebook groups.
Twitter, which is not called that. But I think what's really powerful, and I've shared this in the workshops, and that's been really helpful for me, is actually how Charlotte Mason's pedagogy supports this process of learning. It's a paper I presented at the Q Methodology Conference last year in Belfast, Northern Ireland, which is about the fact that it requires focus. So Mason said attention. They have to look at each statement one at a time, decide if it goes on the right or the left generally, and then they look at them a second time, and they put them into a forced grid, lots of little boxes that form, a peak at the top and then small ones at the end, and what is most like my view and what is most unlike my view. And they sort the statements into those. So Mason said we need to narrate. To narrate is to know. You have to know what we think about something. And what's so different than a typical survey is they have to look at those statements and they have to decide how they fit in relationship to all the others. Of these two, which do I think is more important? Of these two, which I think is more important? Yeah. And so those statements find a place in relationship to everything else. But what's so powerful in the workshops has been the learning that happens, because what happens afterwards, everybody has a shared language to talk about the problem. So you've actually conducted an incredible amount of learning with a very atypical pedagogy, and suddenly your stakeholders have a language to talk about what's working, what's not working, and what we might do about it. We had great feedback. I think some of the best I've heard were a number of people who said, I get invited to one of these things a week, where either a council or a charity or somebody is working with some researcher and we have to do something, for research. This is the best thing I've been to. And so there's something about the process that we're creating an atmosphere, a space for people to engage together as equals who all have something to contribute to thinking about how we might do that. So we're in the stages now of beginning our data analysis on it, our factor interpretation. And what we're hoping to do, and I think it's going to be really wonderful, is to feed those back into viewpoints that the community can understand, to understand almost discourses or perspectives. Mm-hmm. But what was really exciting, when you did say what's cool that we've done, is that initial set of ideas and statements from that really broad approach to the county. We were approached by a commissioned cabinet level report that needed to be created around large demographic changes in the UK. And we were able, through Alex Scott, to have a relationship with this team of researchers. And I was able to develop these demographic tensions that are evident across the county in response to having all of those statements. And so we were able to write and draft that, get it in right before PERTA restrictions went in by about an hour so that it could go to the new government. And it was so wonderful because they came back to us and they said, we're going to have nothing like the case study you were able to offer us because nobody else is asking this kind of question. So there's something about the broadness of the question and the broadness of the engagement that isn't a narrow research focus, which, believe it or not, gets us into trouble with article reviewers who want to say, where's your tiny niche? We say, well, that's not how we're approaching the question. Yeah. But it's about what comes out of that, the action research, the change in policy, the perspectives that have been shifted as a result of the questions we were asking.
That's phenomenal for two reasons. First of all, it's fascinating what you just said, but the fact that you told me without any notes or references, well, it means it's come from the heart, isn't it? Something that made, and has it made an impact on you both? Was it something that you set off thinking, yeah, well, we can do some good here? And then as you've discovered, this wealth of expertise and people giving their time and all the rest of it, at a time of change in the country, I mean, a perfect opportunity to gather information at a time when government and councils and others will be looking to make a change.
People said, I'm coming here to this workshop, to this process with lots of different hats on. Am I supposed to look at this with my role as chief executive of this charity, or volunteer with this community group, or a member of a church that I'm very active in? And we said, look at it from your personal perspective, your whole self. And I think people were really felt empowered by that. That was an opportunity for them to not so much take off those hats, keep them all on, but at the same time say, look, I have a lot of lived experience of living in this community, volunteering in this organization or group, and doing my day job, and having a family, or having an extended family, or being a part of a football team or whatever. And I'm going to bring all my whole self to this process, and I'm going to look at it as a person with all these experiences. So I think that was an opportunity for them to really engage with it meaningfully.
The challenge for me really keeps you on your toes, because there's nothing like an American accent and a Canadian accent in a room full of Cumbrians trying to have them think about how they might change their community. As I would say in every workshop, you are the experts, and you can go into your communities, do this Q study. It was also available online, side by side with somebody who's important, your neighbor, somebody whose voice you think need to be heard, because I'm not going to be the one who needs to go and do that. So I was certainly on my toes in every workshop, in every meeting. But I think that alertness also caused me to find different language. It made me really value and pay attention to how others were framing things so that I could begin to understand what the differences were. Because when I go and do the factor interpretation on the sorts themselves, there's a lot of argument in Q on whether it's a mixed method or a qualitative method, or I call it a qualitative method that uses math. You need to bring in all of that. What people said, how they acted, how they interacted. I'm a bit of an anthropologist in some ways. For me, it was the ways in which I'm so interested in how we can actually achieve the SDGs. And I know that that's impossible. But I firmly believe that it's local leadership. It's local people Mason talked a lot about citizenship. She said her work was aimed at the public good. And it's about personal responsibility that we take for the public good. And so the ways in which we're going to do that are going to vary. It's going to be different language in different contexts. We're going to require lots of people stepping in. So I think that the biggest thing for me that came out of it maybe was that sense of constantly adapting language ideas into the place where you are, letting go of ownership over the outcome of it, to truly honor the born personhood of the people gathered and say, what are you going to do with this?
I just wonder as well, when it comes to researchers and students who are listening to this, hopefully, obviously they can't help but being enthused because you're both so enthusiastic about the work you've done. It'd be great to hear the outcome as well. I'm guessing it's far too early to look at any emerging trends, but when they do come out, it'll be fascinating. But just go back a little bit. When it comes to research, the practice of doing what you've been doing, which you've done for years as well, why does it turn you on? Why is it so important and fascinating and frustrating, I'm sure, as well? What would you say to people who are listening to this thinking, that sounds interesting, I might look at that as a career or might study it? What advice or observations would you offer?
We need to understand that learning and bringing all sorts of knowledge together is what's going to matter most, period. And so if we don't have good knowledge, quality research, it can't find a place at the table. Now, there's all sorts of problems with co-production, bringing it to the table, translating it for the public. But what matters first is that we actually know things. A lot of our research focuses on an idea called ecological reflexivity, which is the ability for a system, a set of ideas, a group of people to understand state shifts in the Earth system, radical changes, because we're living in an era where it's not predictable anymore. And they're actually able to take that knowledge in and adjust or change the way that they act, the way that they govern together, the way that they make policy, or even the way they engage because of that knowledge. And so why does it matter? Why would anybody want to come do this? Because I think it really is the thing needed most to bring answers to bear on the problems we're facing.
I started my professional life as a volunteer in West Africa way back in 1978. And I was a volunteer teacher in Southeast Nigeria in a small community school. And I think right from the beginning, I was very passionate about the idea of think globally, act locally. And it's something that I was doing at that time, many, many years ago. And then I sort of went to the global level and kind of lost that connection to the local level. That was something that I kind of noticed in after those volunteer years, taking on a field director role, but then going back to Canada and then working internationally post-PhD. I ended up doing a lot of work with UN agencies, looking at partnership working, looking at business strategies, running workshops, but very much in Bangkok, in Nairobi, in Dakar, in Geneva, in New York. And I think I lost touch with that local. And one of the things that's happened in Cumbria is I'm still thinking globally, but I'm definitely acting much more locally. And I think that local, for me, is the thing that we really do need to focus on in the face of the problems that we face as a planet, is that local application, that local understanding, that local learning, and that local engagement and listening, active listening to what's happening on the ground and really beginning to understand much better about what's needed to make the change that needs to happen. And I think this kind of research is all about that. And so as much as we are providing a process that enables people to sense make and to articulate and to share, Joanna and I are very much learning a lot from that local engagement.
If you were to describe yourself in a single word, what word would you use to describe yourself?
I think I'll go with inclusive. I'm passionate about that. It's something I always aim for in my teaching, in my research, in my way of living, I think, is being open to involving and engaging as wide a diversity of perspectives and people.
So when I read it on the form weeks ago, I originally came up with enthusiastic, because I joke, everyone says that about me. But I was trying to think what was underneath that, actually, and I realized it's the word empowered. And I think it's because I go by the maxim, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I've had so much poured into me in my life by others, and I'm also a person of faith. And so it gives me a real sense of understanding that I do have influence, I do have power. I do have a way of engaging that can make change in the world. And it doesn't mean I don't make room for everybody else to have the same. In fact, I want everybody else to feel the same. But it means I do approach life with this sense of being empowered to do that. And I was thinking about Mason saying that ideas are spiritual, and that we need ideas like we need food to be fed. And there's something about this life of research that is full, is rich, is about lifelong learning. And so, people say those who can't do teach or something, but those who can't learn research so they can learn. But I think there's a richness in a life where you are open and learning all the time that is not one I would give up.
Postgraduate researcher Joanna Stanberry and Dr. David Murphy, Associate Professor of Sustainability and Collaborative Leadership. Thanks for downloading this edition of Research Spotlight at Cumbria.
Be sure to subscribe and spread the word.